before street lamps glowed, before the rumble of cars shattered the quiet. There was a time when people listened to the world with nothing but their own breath. A distant time when darkness lay thick as a black shroud over small villages, and every faint sound made the heart stumble. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a medieval European forest. The cold air grips your cloak. The night sky above is blurred by a veil of silver fog. Only the wind moves threading through the pines before dissolving into the endless dark. Everything is so still you can hear your own heartbeat, until, from deep in the woods, a long, broken sound rises, a distant howl that prickles the back of your neck. Night then was nothing like our gentle, electric night. It lived, it moved, it listened, and sometimes it answered. In an age when knowledge was far smaller than fear, people tried to explain the darkness with stories. Stories of a creature, half man, half beast, lurking somewhere in the woods, a shape they feared, yet believed in all the same. They said that when winter arrived, the wolves came closer to the villages. Their howls echoed over snow-covered roofs like the voices of ancient spirits. Packs prowled along the tree line, their amber eyes glowing in the dark, and when someone vanished, or when an animal was found torn apart, no one blamed nature. Everyone thought of it. Inside a small wooden cottage, the fire flickered weakly, fighting off the cold. The elders told stories, while the children curled closer to the hearth. Everyone knew there were things in the forest that should not be named, should not be provoked, and should certainly not be stared at too long. Their world was small, and the unknown was far too vast and far too close. Yet it was in that fragility that legends were born, not from malice, but from humanity's deepest anxiety about what might be watching from within the darkness. The werewolf myth is not just the tale of a monster, it is the tale of the night, of silence, of that chilling sense that someone or something is following you. And in those moments, when the howl blends with the wind, no one can say with certainty what is animal, what is human, or what might be far more terrifying than either. If you enjoy these gentle descents into the dark stories, cool enough to give you a shiver, yet soft enough to lull you towards sleep, leave a comment and subscribe. Our journey deeper into the night is only beginning. Imagine the night continuing. After that first distant howl, the air thickens, as if the entire forest is holding its breath. The moon is a thin stroke of silver ink drawn across the sky, bright enough to glint on the snow, but not enough to reveal whatever is moving between the blackened trunks. In an age without a single artificial light beyond a trembling candle flame, every shift in the darkness became a question without an answer. A dry branch snapping under something's weight, the faint rustle of leaves at the forest's edge, a cold breath slipping through the cracks of a wooden door. Any of it could be a wolf, or, as the old folk believed, something wolf-like, but not truly a wolf. In medieval Europe, the forest was both sacred and terrifying. It was vast, ancient, and unknowable. Villagers only entered by daylight, always following familiar paths, and even then, they felt watched by eyes wild, patient, and silent. That's where the whispered stories began. Some swore they saw a massive dark figure moving on four legs, yet its posture curved, as though it might stand upright at any moment. Others claimed the eyes they met were not the yellow of a wolf, but a human gaze burning with a trapped, furious intelligence. But what made those tales believable in their time wasn't the shape they described, it was the sound. Real wolves howl in steady, haunting tones. But people swore they heard howls, broken, uneven, as if someone were struggling to imitate a beast. A sound not quite natural, not quite human, suspended somewhere in between. A voice trapped between two worlds, familiar yet utterly alien. And in that confusion, fear only grew. Because if the creature could mimic a human, could it be a human? In those days, No possibility was dismissed. When night fell, the boundary between man and beast blurred like mist dissolving into wind. Travelers returning late were given 2 warnings. Don't run if you hear wolves. And if the howl sounds almost human, turn around quickly. Perhaps the most frightening thought wasn't that a creature stalked the forest. It was the idea that it could step out of the darkness at any moment. And when the moonlight finally revealed its shape, you would realize the truth the old people feared to speak aloud. It was once one of us. If these winter night visions are beginning to fade like a dream, leave a small comment or subscribe. Together, we'll walk deeper into the story's quieter chapters, softly, slowly, and filled with echoes from the past. In the Middle Ages, people lived in a world where everything had a soul. There were no sharp borders between the natural and the supernatural, between the realm of humans and the realm of things that could not be named. That belief wasn't superstition, it was how they kept their minds steady in a life full of uncertainty. If you walked through the small villages of Europe in those days, you'd see a world woven from the simplest things: wooden roofs, hand-built animal pens, thin curls of chimney smoke rising each morning, and dirt roads winding toward the fields. And surrounding it all like a living wall was the forest. Forest everywhere, deep, dark, and filled with sounds no one could explain. When the sun set, people shut their doors early, not because they feared other people, but because they feared what existed beyond the reach of the hearth's glow. To them, the darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence, a character lurking in every corner, every alley, every path not yet traveled. Knowledge of nature, the body, illness, was nearly non-existent, so they created stories to fill the gaps. When someone suddenly behaved strangely, bursting into anger without cause, wandering the woods, eating erratically, or suffering convulsions, they didn't think of science or medicine. They thought of a curse. They thought of transformation. Medieval Europe had many versions of the werewolf. In France, the shapeshifter was the loup-garou. In Germany, they spoke of the werewolf. In Scandinavia, villagers believed warriors could take on the wolf's shape to gain supernatural strength. The names differed, but the emotion behind the stories was always the same: the fear that someone in the village carried something inside them that did not belong to humankind. But here's the fascinating part. People didn't tell these stories to scare each other. They told them to comfort each other. They told them to believe that everything had a cause, even if the cause lived in the blur between myth and reality. When they couldn't explain a person's strange behavior, giving it a familiar story eased their minds. It made them feel as if they understood what was happening. The werewolf legends spread not because they were terrifying, but because they created an invisible sense of order. Humans fear what they cannot name, so they gave their fear a name. They gave it a shape. And then they could finally breathe a little easier, because they no longer faced the unknown. In a world that simple, myths weren't luxuries. They were necessities, places where people found comfort during long, freezing nights. They were a small flame held up against everything they had yet to understand. If you enjoy the way old stories reflect our fears and beliefs, leave a few thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe so we can continue this gentle journey through the misty layers of the past. In the minds of those who lived in medieval Europe, religion wasn't just belief. It was the only compass. They had something to guide them through a world full of uncertainty. When they couldn't understand why someone fell ill, why a winter stretched longer than usual, or why a howl in the forest sounded almost human, they looked to the church, seeking answers in the flicker of candles beneath cold stone arches. Picture a winter evening. A small church stands at the center of the village, its thick stone walls streaked with moss. Inside, the faint breath of hymn singing drifts through the chilly air. Candlelight trembles across the face of the priest, the one person villagers trusted to understand the will of God and the intentions of whatever dwelled in the dark. In those days, the church taught that the world was divided into 2 realms, the light of God and the darkness of the devil. Anything unusual, anything that broke the pattern of everyday life, was judged along that line. And so stories of werewolves, of shapeshifters, of people losing control, of those pulled by the darkness within, were naturally seen as signs of demonic influence. The remarkable thing is, the villagers didn't reject these stories. They believed them partly because they'd heard them since childhood, but mostly because they needed them to make sense of the chaos around them. When someone erupted in sudden rage, or when a wanderer returned from the woods with strange eyes and stranger silence, the church offered a simple explanation. Darkness has touched them. The church wasn't trying to spread fear. It was speaking in the only language people of that era understood. Everything born of darkness must be treated with caution, and among all the creatures of legend, the werewolf was the easiest to believe. It was familiar. Tied to the forest, every village stood beside one. Tied to predators, every family had livestock threatened by wolves. And tied to the human heart, its instincts, its anger, its hidden impulses they feared might spill out. In the priest's sermons, the werewolf became a living parable of the battle between the human and the beast, between reason and instinct. It became a tool to remind villagers to live right, to live purely, to avoid being claimed by the shadows. And so the werewolf didn't just wander in the woods. It stepped into the church, into warnings from the pulpit, into moral tales, into the trembling candlelight of Sunday nights. In the cold stillness of the stone chapel, people believed that if a sleeping beast lived inside each of us, it took only a single misstep to wake it. And once awakened, it didn't just transform, it slipped away from the light of God. If these images stir something in your imagination, leave a comment and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can continue following the quiet path of old fears, gently, slowly, like a candle burning down into the night. When we look back at medieval Europe, it's easy to forget that most fears didn't come from legends, but from everyday life. Those years were anything but gentle. Crops failed. Winters stretched longer than anyone expected. Wild animals crept closer to the villages. And whenever the sky turned grey, people knew the months ahead would be a battle between themselves and nature, a battle humans often lost. Imagine a winter morning. The fog is so thick you can't see the house next door. Livestock stir with tired, frost-blurred eyes. Wind slips through the cracks of old wooden walls, making everyone shiver. The men head out to the fields to break through frozen ground for water, while the women gather the last scraps of dry firewood. Hunger didn't strike all at once. It stalked them quietly, day by day. In times like these, people began to search for a reason behind their suffering. There was no science to explain why crops died, why animals fell sick, or why a child spiked a sudden fever and never recovered. When there was no answer, the mind turned to the thing it understood best, fear. And fear, as we know, always demands a shape. In many villages, when misfortunes piled up, whispers began. At first they were small, like wind brushing the eaves. Someone claimed they saw a large shadow in the forest, standing upright like a man. Someone else said they heard a howl that sounded as if someone were calling their name. Slowly, those whispers stopped being harmless. Chaos made communities believe the worst. Anyone with unusual behavior became suspect. The reclusive were criticized. Those who walked alone in the woods, stayed up late, or didn't blend in easily, became targets for supernatural blame. The tragic truth is that they didn't do this out of cruelty. They did it because they needed someone to bear their fears. They needed a beast to place on the altar of their anxieties and say, "This misfortune is because of that." Once they had a name, a face, a story, people felt lighter. Even if reality didn't change, the sense of helplessness eased. During such times, werewolf stories spread more fiercely than ever, not because they were more real, but because people needed them more. They needed explanations. They needed to believe their suffering wasn't random. So when night fell, snow weighed down the rooftops, and wind howled across the barren fields. Villagers gathered around the fire, clinging to what warmth remained. And in that flickering glow, the tale of the one who wears the beast's form surfaced, offering them a way to understand their world. Even if the story was frightening, it was still easier to accept than the idea that life was nothing more than cruel chance. If these perspectives draw you into a world both strange and familiar, leave a small comment below, and remember to subscribe so we can continue walking through the thick fog of the past, slowly, gently, guided by distant echoes. In the small medieval villages, where everyone had known each other since childhood, rumors were never just idle words. They were like thin wisps of smoke you never saw where they began. Yet with one cold night's wind, they slipped through every doorway, into every kitchen, into every family meal. When life grew harsh and unpredictable, rumors caught fire even more easily. One person behaved strangely. A dark figure stood in the trees. An animal was found torn apart at dawn. That was enough for whispers to begin. First one, then two. Then, fed by the community's collective anxiety, they grew into longer, more detailed stories, with each retelling. And as the rumors spread, collective fear took shape. In those days, people had no newspapers, no science, no doctors to explain what was happening. They only had each other and the belief that the devil constantly lurked at the edge of their world. It was easy for a small tale to become evidence. I heard a howl right outside my window. I saw someone walking in the woods at midnight. My dog growled at its own shadow. None of these meant much on their own. But when an entire village heard them and believed them, everything became frighteningly real. What pushed rumors into full eruption, however, was the arrival of new laws. During the centuries of witch hunting, local authorities issued rules that allowed investigations, accusations, even executions of anyone suspected of serving dark forces. And suddenly, what once belonged to quiet fireside whispers became the focus of official village meetings. On cold evenings, villagers gathered in the communal hall, torchlight flickering against the stone walls. The worries that once lived only in private conversations now lay on the table. The village headman or the priest studied a list of unsettling events: who had lost livestock, who had fallen ill with a strange fever, who had spent too much time alone in the woods. No one spoke the words werewolf aloud, but everyone was thinking it. It took just one person to say it, and the room tightened, as if the night itself had seeped in through the small window. With laws permitting investigations into demonic suspicion, anyone could become a target. A strange gesture, a rude remark, a peculiar scar, each was enough to summon someone for questioning. The line between rumor and law vanished. What had once been whispered in private became the community's official business. Werewolf hunts did not begin with beasts. They began with village meetings, with sideways glances, with the soft tap of a quill against a wooden table, with the silent agreement of people who were afraid, but also comforted by the thought that, if someone else was suspected, then fate was not aimed at them. In such a world, no one needed to see a werewolf to believe in one. If the rumors grew large enough, and the fear burrowed deep enough, the law would take care of the rest. If this passage reminds you that fear often hides not in the darkness, but in the human heart, leave a few thoughts below, and remember to subscribe so we can continue tracing how that world slipped slowly, quietly, into centuries of relentless hunts. In those chaotic years, something shifted quietly, yet powerfully, a change that swept countless lives into a merciless tide. It was the moment when lycanthropy, once understood as a psychological or medical condition, began to be seen as a mark of demonic influence. And once something was attributed to the devil, it was no longer a matter to be treated, but a sin to be punished. Long ago, simple village healers had recorded cases of people falling into delirious states, believing themselves to be animals. They wandered the woods, avoided sunlight, lashed out unpredictably. No one knew these were signs of mental illness, exhaustion, or some deep inner wound that words could not capture. But even in their confusion, people still believed such states could be healed with rest, with prayer, with hope. Then religion grew harsher. Strange illnesses were interpreted through the lens of scripture. What had once been mere weariness of the spirit was now read as a clear warning, a soul being pulled away from the light. In this climate, someone experiencing lycanthropy, a panic episode, a dissociation, a collapse of identity, was no longer viewed with sympathy. People began to see them as allies of darkness. Every small behavior became evidence. If someone ate more than usual, they were hungry like a beast. If someone breathed heavily after labor, they growled like a wolf. If someone preferred solitude, they were hiding something. The smallest everyday traits were gathered into a single box, and that box was labeled suspicion. In its attempt to protect the faithful, the church unintentionally deepened the community's fear. Priests reminded villagers that demons often used human bodies as vessels. They urged caution toward those who behaved differently. And so instead of asking, "Is this person all right?" people began asking, "Is this person still human?" The shift happened slowly, like frost layering itself on a rooftop. No one noticed the exact moment when illness became sin. But by the time they realized, people were already being tied up, summoned before councils, and cast in the role of servants of the devil, simply because they were different. Lycanthropy was no longer something to heal. It became evidence, a reason to isolate someone, a convenient explanation for all that went wrong. And the darkest truth of all was this: once a community believed a person was no longer entirely human, they felt fully justified in punishing them. In the twilight of that era, the line between sickness and guilt blurred, fading like moonlight behind gathering clouds. And when that boundary disappeared, the first werewolf trials emerged, not because there was proof, but because people believed they had finally found the source of their fear. If you feel how small shifts in history can lead to immense tragedy, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe. The next part of our journey takes us into the real trials, where fear transformed into action. As the late Middle Ages approached, fear no longer lived only in stories by the hearth or whispered prayers in church. It began to take shape on parchment, rolls of animal skin, trembling under candlelight, covered in dark, uneven ink, opened a new doorway. A doorway into trials that, even today, send a chill up the spine when we read them. And the strangest part is this: those trials did not begin with evidence. They began with fear. Imagine a grey morning in a small Central European village. A light drizzle falls, not enough to be a true rain, but enough to soak everything in a cold, bleak dampness. Villagers walk silently toward the wooden hall where the council meets. On the table, a single candle burns low, its flame wavering each time a gust slips through the cracks. At the center of the room, a man, often the village headman, sometimes a priest, unrolls a fresh piece of parchment, and on it, he writes the first name in what history will call the werewolf trials. Those first lines were not legal documentation. They were the crystallization of months of rumor, dread, and unanswered questions. Someone saw a strange shape at the edge of the woods. An animal was found torn apart, as if by claws. Last night, a howl sounded like a human voice. Today, these phrases merely stir the imagination. But back then, they were reason enough to launch an investigation. And medieval investigations were nothing like those of today. There were no tests, no verification, no experts. Perhaps the only thing they relied on was the seriousness in the storyteller's eyes and the fear reflected in everyone else's. When the accused was brought in, they were rarely someone caught in the act. Most were simply people singled out by neighbors. Someone who lived alone, someone quieter than usual, someone who had walked into the woods to gather firewood, someone with a strange scar. Such things, in that world, were enough to place a person in the center of the room. The courtroom was never loud. It was heavy, like a rain-soaked cloak. The accused stood before the gaze of the entire village, a gaze filled with fear and a desperate wish. If it's him, then the misfortune is not ours. Interrogation didn't begin with questions, but with an unspoken certainty that the person before them had already been touched by something dark. The questions were designed not to discover the truth, but to reinforce what they believed. Have you ever walked in the woods during a full moon? Have you heard any voices calling you at night? Do you dream of yourself as a beast? Each question narrowed the walls around them, pushing the accused into a darkness they could not escape. And every answer, no matter how harmless, was interpreted in a way that made them seem more suspicious. This was the moment when legend stepped out of the realm of stories and became part of the law, part of reality, part of someone's fate. And this was only the beginning. If you want to keep exploring these eerie and heartbreaking trials, leave a few thoughts below and remember to subscribe as we step into the next chapter where real names emerge from the shadows. Among all the names recorded in Europe's werewolf trials, none is more infamous than Peter Stump. His story has survived across centuries, a tragedy on one hand, and on the other, a mirror reflecting the hysteria of an age. But to understand Peter, we cannot begin with the accusations. We must begin with loneliness, the quiet fog that wrapped around him like the cold mist settling over the German fields of his time. Picture the rural outskirts of Cologne in the late 16th century. Wide stretches of farmland, sparse homesteads, forests standing like dark, unblinking sentinels around the villages. This is where Peter lived. A middle-aged man, quiet, working alone more often than with others. He had no large family, no close companions. People like him were easy to notice, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they were different. And in fearful times, difference is the most fertile soil for suspicion. Villagers said Peter often walked the forest's edge at dusk. Someone claimed they saw him bent close to the ground, as if searching for something. Others whispered that he returned home late at night, cloak muddy, expression tired. Today, such things would draw little attention, but in the 16th century, when wolves roamed, livestock vanished, and rumors flew faster than the wind, these small details became pieces of a monstrous puzzle. Then one night, a cow was found savaged on the village outskirts. No one saw the attacker. No one heard a sound, but someone mentioned that the night before, they had seen Peter walking near that spot, and that single comment was enough. One stray observation, one unfortunate coincidence. Suddenly his name appeared on the parchment, as though fate had been waiting. When Peter was arrested, he never had a chance to explain. No one truly asked where he had been or what he had done. The interrogators had already decided he was the man who wore the wolf's shape. They only wanted him to confirm it. Under torture, under the crushing weight of a terrified village, Peter finally confessed to owning a magic belt, an item, he said, allowed him to transform into a wolf. Today, it is painfully clear this was no voluntary confession. A lonely, exhausted man, surrounded by fear, cornered by authority, will say anything to make the nightmare stop. But in those days, his admission was taken as pure, undeniable truth. According to the records, Peter went on to describe running on all fours, possessing strength beyond any man, and tearing livestock like a wild beast. Instead of questioning the absurdity of these claims, the villagers accepted them as proof that the devil had taken root among them. No one asked whether he was ill. No one asked whether he was desperate, frightened, or crushed by a life too harsh to bear. They did not examine his mind. They hunted a monster. And when people go looking for monsters, they always find them. Peter Stump's trial ended swiftly with a sentence of death, but his execution did not close the story. It opened a new chapter, one in which anyone, simply for being different, could become the next werewolf. If Peter's story brings you a quiet, ancient sadness, the sadness of an age ruled more by fear than understanding, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe as we continue toward cases even stranger, even sadder, and just as haunting. If Peter Stump's story was the tragedy of a solitary man, the tale of the Gandillon family is a haunting reminder that when a community drowns in fear, it can swallow an entire bloodline. And the most terrifying part isn't the monster, it's how panic spreads from person to person, like fire catching on dry straw. Let us return to Eastern France, the late 16th century. This was a time when survival depended entirely on harmony. Villagers needed each other to endure winter, to break the frozen soil, to keep their children safe when night fell. But when one family was seen as different, that fragile harmony shattered with alarming speed. The Gandillons lived in the rural region of Jura, a land of deep forests and mountainous shadows, where the woods felt dense enough to hide any secret. 3 members of the family were accused of being werewolves: Perron, Pierre, and Georges Gandillon. They were not wealthy, not influential, not powerful enough to defend themselves. And like so many tragedies of that era, what drew attention to them was not evidence, it was rumor. People said Perron looked wild, that she wandered into the woods more often than other women. They said Pierre stared too long into the darkness, as if he heard things others could not. And they swore George showed unnatural strength while working in the fields. In another age, these would be quirks, nothing more. But in an age ruled by fear, they became proof. Then one day, a boy in the village was injured by a wild animal. In his panic, he claimed the attacker had a human shape, and that was all it took. The moment the Gandillon name was mentioned, they were trapped. When fear chooses a name, no second reason is ever needed. The trial of the Gandillon family began like countless others. No evidence, only whispers, worried faces, and the suffocating weight of collective dread. When the 3 were brought before the court, they stood surrounded by the very people they had lived, beside people they had greeted every morning. They transform into wolves. They eat human flesh. They serve the devil. Accusations were thrown like stones without hesitation, without proof. The words survived only through the sheer inertia of panic. Under interrogation, Perron, wounded after being seized by villagers, began to say what they wanted to hear. She claimed she ran on all fours, that claws grew from her hands, that the devil gave her strength. Her statements, preserved in records, are impossibly fantastical to modern eyes. But a frightened, injured person surrounded by hostility will say anything to stop the nightmare. The Gandillons were condemned, executed as werewolves. Yet their deaths were not the true ending. What remained behind was a fracture in the community, an unspoken wound. Because when a village kills an entire family on rumor alone, someone always lies awake at night, thinking quietly, did we do the right thing? But in those days, such questions were never spoken aloud. Fear was too powerful, and silence was easier than admitting that perhaps the real monster wasn't what they burned. If the story of the Gandillon family reminds you how fear can turn a whole community into unknowing judges, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe. Our next steps will take us even deeper into the hysteria of that age, where the darkness did not live in the forest, but in the human heart. Today, when we think of evidence, we imagine fingerprints, forensics, medical reports, machines, and science. But in medieval Europe, proof was not something that existed in the physical world. It was something woven from fear, imagination, and the vast gaps in human understanding. And those gaps, far wider than any forest, created the werewolf trials that still make history shudder. Let's look at what people of that time considered signs of a werewolf. At the edge of a forest, they might find animal tracks pressed into the mud. But muddy soil distorts everything. The prints could be wolf, could be dog, could be anything shaped by rain and chance. Yet in the minds of those already convinced, it was evidence. Livestock attacked by wild animals left deep, uneven bite marks, exactly what you'd expect from a predator desperate and panicked in winter. But villagers saw them as the teeth marks of a creature, half man, half beast. No one thought of rabies, or a displaced wolf pack, or starving animals driven close to human homes. They saw only what they were prepared to see: the presence of a monster, a man with long fingernails because he hadn't trimmed them, a healed scar on someone's arm, a man who kept his eyes down when he walked. Such things, in the 1500s, became abnormal indicators. But the most frightening part is this: evidence was often not physical at all. It was spoken. A child said they saw glowing eyes in the dark. Children misunderstand, they imagine. But that single sentence could bind the fate of an adult. A woman claimed she heard a sound, like a person howling back at the wolves. No one considered that it might be the wind slipping through stones. They thought only of werewolves. A man trembling with fear said he dreamed of a beast standing at his window. And dreams, in that era, were sometimes accepted as evidence. What made these signs so dangerous wasn't the signs themselves, but how they were interpreted. People did not ask, "Could this be something else?" They asked, "Is this the werewolf?" And when the question is loaded from the start, the answer is almost always the same. The accused had little chance to defend themselves. If they denied knowing anything about shape-shifting, the villagers concluded the devil erased their memory. If they said they were victims of circumstance, the answer was, the devil always teaches his servants to deny. Every denial became evidence against them. Every oath sounded like deceit, and silence, sometimes born of sheer hopelessness, became the strongest proof. In the dim light of the meeting hall, where a few candles flickered like dying stars, the interrogators did not see truth. They saw their own fear reflected in another human being. In that era, darkness did not need a real monster to create evidence. It only needed people to believe that a monster existed. And when belief grew stronger than reason, science, or compassion, anything they found could become proof. If you feel the fragile line between belief and fear in these stories, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, we enter the darkest stretch of history, a place where verdicts were no longer guided by logic, but by the collective hysteria of a frightened world. History often whispers to us softly, like wind brushing across old rooftops, that in times ruled by fear, an accusation needs no reason. It only needs a crowd. And in the medieval werewolf trials, the crowd was the true court, the place where judgment was sealed long before the accused ever entered the room. Picture the scene: a small village, a meeting hall standing in the center of a packed dirt square. Outside, the wind howls, whipping dust and dry leaves into small spirals. Inside, villagers squeeze shoulder to shoulder, breaths heavy, eyes fixed on the door that is about to open. No one speaks loudly, but the murmurs rise like waves, carrying words that are both vague and sharp. Werewolf, devil, shape-shifting, children. When the accused steps inside, the room seems to shrink, not because the walls move, but because dozens of eyes settle on them. Eyes not searching for truth or understanding, but waiting for confirmation of what they already believe. In those days, the terror did not come from judges or laws. It came from the atmosphere. Fear passed from one person to the next like embers passed hand to hand, heating the room with emotions no one fully understood. Today, we would call it mass hysteria, but to people of that era, it was simply God's will, a sign, or an omen. When a witness stood and claimed they had seen glowing eyes in the dark, the crowd nodded without hesitation. When someone insisted they heard a growl not made by man, the crowd exhaled in grim agreement, as if the truth had finally revealed itself. No one questioned whether the mist distorted their sight. No one wondered if the wind could mimic strange sounds, because in that moment, they needed a story, They needed a name to carry their fear. And once a name existed, everything that followed was merely ritual. A coerced confession. The crowd saw it as solid proof. A shiver from cold. A sign of guilt. A single tear. The weakness of someone who has sinned. In the thick, breathless silence, verdicts were not shaped by logic, but by collective belief. And that belief was so powerful that sometimes a single nod from the benches was enough for the judge to roll up the parchment and read the final sentence. The accused rarely shouted or resisted. Perhaps they knew that one voice could never rise above the noise of an entire village. Perhaps they were exhausted, or perhaps, in that moment, they understood that what stood in judgment before them was not a crime or evidence. It was the fear of those who watched. And so, verdicts were rendered not by truth, but by the whispers of the crowd, by the village's desire to reassure itself, to push misfortune away by condemning someone else. To us, it is injustice. To them, it was survival. If these stories reveal a shadowed corner of human nature, one we rarely dare look at, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, we move into a new chapter, the moment when science and reason begin to challenge what was once called the work of demons. Across centuries, the stories of werewolves echoed through old forests, like voices that refused to fade. But as the world entered a new era, an age of reason, research, and scientific light, people began to see that much of what had once been called proof of werewolves was simply misunderstanding of the human body, of nature, and of fear itself. And that realization came gently, slowly, like sunrise after a long night, turning monstrous shapes into nothing more than harmless shadows of trees. Let's begin with one of the biggest culprits, rabies. In the Middle Ages, rabies was an invisible demon. When someone was bitten by a wolf or a dog, they didn't just carry a wound, they carried a disease that could make them fear, water, convulse, scream, act violently, lose control of their body and awareness. Anyone watching might believe they were transforming. But people in the 16th century had no concept of viruses, no biology, no medical science. What they saw, the only thing they could understand, was someone slowly becoming a beast. Then came ergot poisoning, a fungus that grew on rye, especially in years of poor harvest. Those who ate contaminated grain suffered hallucinations, trembling, spasms, even visions of strange creatures or distorted faces. Villagers never knew they had eaten poisoned bread. They only saw someone acting bizarrely, muttering nonsense, or falling into madness. And in a mind shaped by myth, madness always pointed toward the supernatural. Next were mental disorders, conditions we now recognize under names like delusions, dissociation, or behavioral dysregulation. But in that era, mental illness was untreated and often misunderstood. No doctors, no therapy, no vocabulary for what was happening inside the mind. Some sufferers genuinely believed they were animals. They ran on all fours, growled, hid in forests, or feared sunlight. In a society exhausted, religiously rigid, and chronically anxious, such a person became an obvious target. What we now explain with hormones, neurology, and environmental stresses, they attributed to demons. But the truth was not only in disease, it was also in collective psychology. Modern scholars call it mass hysteria, collective panic. When a community lives in fear long enough, it begins to perceive danger everywhere. A normal howl sounds like a human cry. A shadow becomes a monster's silhouette. A loner becomes the perfect suspect. This did not make people of the past foolish. It revealed how harsh their world was, and how fear was simply a survival mechanism. In an age when nights were longer than days, when wild animals feared no human, when illness had no cure, misreading reality wasn't a weakness, it was instinct. Looking back today, we don't see only mistakes. We see human fragility, We see a society struggling to understand its world without the tools we now take for granted. We see sincere beliefs misguided, yes, but born from a very human anxiety, the fear of what cannot be seen. And most of all, we see that the monster never lived inside anyone's body. It lived in the space between human understanding and the dark they had yet to illuminate. If this chapter makes you feel that truth sometimes arrives not as a blinding flash, but as a soft dawn seeping through a window, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next sections, we journey deeper into the heart of what people truly feared, not beasts, but each other. In werewolf lore, what chills us isn't only the image of a half-man, half-beast lurking in the woods. It's the way people of that era looked at one another. If Peter Stump shows us the tragedy of a lonely man, and the Gandion family reveals how merciless rumor can be, then there is another group, nameless, faceless, absent from official records, who were the easiest victims of all, the solitary, those who lived on the margins of the village, on the edge of the forest, on the edges of human attention. And in the Middle Ages, when fear was the common language, solitude was the most dangerous trait a person could possess. Imagine a small village where every person had a clear, visible role: the plowman, the blacksmith, the shepherd, the baker. Anyone who didn't fit into that circle, anyone who did not stand in church on Sundays, who didn't linger to gossip with neighbors, quickly drew suspicious eyes. You can picture them. A man living alone after disease took his family. A middle-aged woman who never married, gathering herbs deep in the forest. A quiet youth who avoided conversation, slipping away into the fields to escape the noise. In our world, these are simply personalities. But in the 16th century, when community was the only shield against nature and misfortune, anyone who stood outside that shield was branded unnatural. And in an age steeped in myth and hysteria, unnatural quickly became dangerous. The lonely were always the first to be blamed. Livestock died? He must know something. A child went missing? That woman who wanders the woods is suspicious. A strange howl echoed at night. That quiet boy was out walking again. What if? No evidence was needed, only a small difference. A deep-set gaze, an odd habit, a slow step. It was enough for fear to cling to them like a shadow no one could shake off. In many historical records, the werewolf trials do not mention only figures like Stump or the Gandions. They also reference countless strange men, forest women, loners at the village edge, odd fellows from the last cottage, names not important enough to preserve, yet important enough to condemn. These people rarely had defenders, no family to speak for them, no social standing to protect them, no friend brave enough to testify. And in moments like these, silence itself became a death sentence. One of the saddest realizations, looking back, is this: these people did nothing wrong. They were only different, a little quieter, a little more withdrawn, a little harder to understand. But in a world terrified of being cut off from the group, those who stood apart became the perfect vessels for collective anxiety. Looking back now, we see clearly that the monster was never them. The monster was the way fear turned neighbors into merciless judges. The monster was solitude misunderstood. The monster was the distance between people, a distance wide enough to swallow a tragedy. And that is the true reminder of that era. Darkness did not only fall on the forest, it settled in the hearts of an entire community. If this chapter makes you think of how fragile we are in the face of invisible judgment, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe. We are approaching the most important part of this journey, where the werewolf stops being a creature in the woods and becomes a symbol of the fear inside each of us. After all the trials, accusations, rumors, and unjust deaths we've walked through, one question slowly rises from the shadows, like the moon slipping out from behind thick clouds. What, truly, is a werewolf? A creature that can transform? A body possessed by demons? A beast stalking the midnight forest? Under the soft light of reason and modern psychology, the answer is unexpectedly gentle, almost heartbreaking. The werewolf was never a creature outside. The werewolf was a mirror of what people feared most inside themselves. Think back to the medieval world, a life of constant uncertainty, a society perched on the edge of hunger, illness, and sudden death, a tiny community where even small changes felt like threats. In such a world, anyone who expressed a strong, frightening emotion, rage, violence, despair became a source of communal anxiety, because they reminded everyone of something uncomfortable. Every human carries a darker side, a part of themselves they'd rather not name, and the werewolf was simply the Middle Ages, giving that part a name. The werewolf represented uncontrolled anger, explosive violence, hunger of the body, the mind, the soul, the feeling of being lost inside oneself. Those moments when a person breaks, becoming wild, terrified, disorganized. To medieval religion, these were signs of demonic influence. To us today, they are deeply human emotions misunderstood, untreated, or unspoken. In an age without any knowledge of mental illness, neurological disorders, chronic stress, or psychological trauma, anyone who broke apart risked being seen as transforming into something no longer human. The werewolf was never half man, half beast. The werewolf was the fear of people who did not understand themselves, and it was also the fear of seeing that wildness in others, the part they tried so hard to hide, the part that, if called by name, would make them feel exposed and fragile. In the trials we explored Peter Stump, the Gandilians, the forgotten loners of small villages. The reason they were condemned was not because they truly resembled beasts. It was because they reminded the community of the beast within themselves. Instead of facing that inner darkness, the village projected it outward, onto one man, one woman, one family. They turned their fear into a person they could kill, burn, erase, even though the real fear never left, quietly living inside each of them. Looking back, we realize something almost poetic in its sorrow. The werewolf is a beautiful symbol, in a very sad way. It is a whisper about human fragility, a mirror held up to the corners of ourselves we avoid, a reminder that between us and the darkness within, the boundary can be as thin as moonlight. If this chapter makes you feel that many monsters in our world are really the parts of humanity we haven't learned to understand, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next section, we step beyond the Middle Ages to explore how the werewolf legend lived on, through literature, through culture, and under the glow of the modern screen. As the werewolf trials faded into the past, when courts stopped recording accusations, when no more names were inked onto trembling parchment, when the final pyres cooled after burning those labeled monsters, the werewolf did not disappear. It simply changed shape. From a terror carved onto human lives, it became a story, a piece of collective memory passed down through generations, in the long, quiet hours beside the hearth. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, like winter melting into spring. The tragedies of Peter Stump or the Gandilan family were no longer spoken with anger or dread. They softened into warnings, then into faint silhouettes of what once terrified all of Europe. And little by little, the tale was reshaped, bent, stretched, embroidered as all ancient stories eventually are. Imagine a small wooden cottage, snow piled against the walls outside. Inside, the fire glows bright. Children gather in a circle, adults rest against the walls, the flames dancing across their faces. Someone begins to speak, not with the stern tone of a priest or the cold precision of a judge, but in a low, gentle voice, like singing an old lullaby. Long ago, in that forest yonder, under a moon as bright as silver, the voice is not meant to condemn anyone, but to stir the imagination. The werewolf is no longer an enemy to be hunted. It becomes a creature of the old woods, of moonlit nights, of mysteries beyond human understanding. A folk figure, a symbol, a story used to teach children, don't wander too deep into the forest. Keep your lantern close. Don't let the darkness swallow you. Yet beneath that storytelling tone sits a quiet sadness, because those who know the history, even just a few, understand that behind every tale lies a real life. Someone trembling before a crowd, someone standing alone beneath a storm of suspicion, a family crushed beneath the weight of a village's fear. Later generations no longer saw that. They heard the story but not the sigh behind it. The next generation heard an even lighter version, and eventually, the werewolf became pure legend, detached from blood and fire, wrapped instead in the gentle mystery of folklore. And strangely enough, the story never died. It traveled with migrants to new lands, crossing mountains, forests, oceans. It was told during snowstorms, written into books, printed in chapbooks, retold in Victorian ghost tales, adapted into black and white films, and finally stepped into modern cinema with new faces, new powers, new tragedies. From the fireside of a small medieval village, the werewolf walked into the world, and in every era, people reshaped it, sometimes stronger, sometimes more terrifying, sometimes more tragic, according to the fears of their own time. But if you look closely, you'll notice something. No matter where the werewolf appears, ancient manuscripts, Hollywood blockbusters, or bedtime stories whispered by grandparents, it always carries the same core from its beginning. The werewolf is the shadow of what we do not understand, the voice of the night forest, the way humans soften their fears by turning them into stories. If this chapter makes you feel the thin thread connecting past and present, like a wisp of smoke rising from an old hearth, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe, because next we step into the modern world, where the werewolf takes on new forms, but human fear remains exactly the same. As the world entered the modern age with electric lights replacing fire, cities rising where villages once stood, and science slowly loosening the grip of superstition, the werewolf myth evolved as well. It was no longer seen through the trembling eyes of medieval villagers. It was reimagined by writers, shaped through camera lenses, and carried by creators who no longer believed in demons, yet remained fascinated by the boundary between human and beast. These new stories no longer unfolded at the edges of German forests or along the mountains of France. They appeared in shuttered rooms, moonlit parks, and fog-covered Hollywood sets. But even as the settings changed, the heart of the werewolf legend held on to one truth. It has always been a story about the conflict within the human soul. Think back to the earliest versions in 19th century literature. The werewolf was painted as brutal fangs, claws, the terror of the chase. But when the 20th century arrived, a new question began to emerge. What if the monster doesn't want to be a monster? What if it knows it's dangerous, but cannot control itself? What if its transformation is not a curse from the devil, but a tragedy of fate? And with that, the werewolf became one of Western culture's most tragic figures. No longer just a hunter of innocence, it became a human being, trapped between two natures, desperate to live as a person, yet dragged into darkness with every full moon. You can see this shift in the early films of the 1940 seconds, where the protagonist clutches his head in despair, begging to be saved from himself. Later versions turned the werewolf into a metaphor for everything humans try to hide: rage, trauma, unspoken grief, the storm of feelings that simmer beneath the surface. In children's stories, the werewolf softened lonely, misunderstood, gentle, even out of place in a world that feared it. In young adult fiction, it became a symbol of adolescence, of bodies changing, emotions surging, instincts awakening with no clear explanation. In action films, the werewolf became a force of power, wild strength, unleashed energy. the fantasy of breaking free from social limits. And in psychological or art house horror, the werewolf turned into metaphor, an image for trauma, loss of control, or the darkness inside the human mind. With each passing decade, the werewolf reinvented itself, shifting forms just as the legends once claimed it could. But across all cultures, all generations, all retellings, one theme remains constant. The werewolf always reflects the era that creates it. In the Middle Ages, it embodied fear of the forest and the unconscious. In the 16th century, it became a tool of punishment and communal control. In the modern world, it stands for pain, fractured identity, and the torn fabric of humanity. Whatever shape it takes, predator, victim, symbol, or metaphor, the werewolf retains an uncanny pull, terrifying yet sympathetic, strange yet familiar, distant yet deeply human. And perhaps that very closeness is why the werewolf survives. Even though no trials remain, the forests are no longer threats, and the moonlight overhead is simply reflected sunlight from a distant sphere. If this chapter helps you see that werewolves live not just in folklore, but in culture, memory, and emotion across generations, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe, because next, we reach the biggest question of all. Why, after hundreds of years, do we keep telling this story? When ancient forests were cut back to make way for cities, when moonlight stopped being the only guide through darkness, and when humans finally understood illness, psychology, and nature, you would think the werewolf would simply fade away. But strangely, it didn't. The werewolf is still here, clear, powerful, alive in the imagination of the modern world. And to understand why, we must look deeper into the dark corners humanity has carried since the beginning. Corners that science can explain, perhaps, but cannot erase. Think about it. Even in an age of bright screens and electric light, we still have moments when instinct speaks louder than reason. Late at night, when the city quiets, when you hear a soft sound outside your window, when you walk through an empty street, breath held for reasons you can't name, something ancient stirs in your chest. We differ from medieval villagers in knowledge, but not in fear. Humans still fear, losing control, losing themselves, the instinct that can flare up when we are weak, and the truth that inside each of us lies a beast we try to hide every day. The werewolf is the perfect image for that fear. Not a fear of a creature in the forest, but the fear of the shadow within us. In the Middle Ages, the werewolf symbolized danger from the outside, the woods, the wild animals, the darkness. In the modern era, the werewolf symbolizes danger from the inside, anger, trauma, instinct. Maybe that is why we keep returning to this myth, because it is not just a monster, it is a story about us. The werewolf survives in modern culture because it touches the experiences humans never fully shake. Those moments when we don't understand why we're angry, when we feel ourselves become different, hurt, harsher, heavier, when something deep beneath logic seems to guide us. The werewolf becomes a language for the rift between who we want to be and who we fear we might become. And beneath all that, perhaps, it is also a story about loneliness. A creature carrying two souls, human and beast, belonging fully to neither, caught between instinct and morality, between moonlight and shadow, never at rest. People see themselves in that struggle, in the isolation, in the quiet tearing inside the heart, the scream we never voice, the turmoil we hide behind silence. The myth survives not because the beast in the forest lives on, but because the beast inside the human spirit has never vanished. And perhaps the comforting part is this: every generation retells the story a little softer, a little deeper, a little more human, as if we are learning, slowly, to face our darkness with understanding instead of fear. If this chapter touched something inside you, something only moonlight can illuminate, leave a thought below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part we reach the end of the journey, where legend meets reality, and and the darkness finds its gentleness. When we look back at the werewolf tales of the Middle Ages, it's easy to dismiss them as relics of a less enlightened time, a time before science, before electricity, before the internet, a time when shadows were thicker and knowledge was thin. But if we look closer quietly, honestly, we find a bittersweet truth. Humanity never stopped creating monsters. They simply changed shape. In the 16th century, the monster wore fur, had golden eyes, and prowled the dark woods. Today, the monsters hide in angry comments, in rumors that spread faster than any medieval whisper, in judgments we fling at strangers after 3 seconds of scrolling. The Middle Ages used gossip to turn a lonely man into a killer. We use social media to do the same. Faster, louder, sharper. Then, villagers gathered in the meeting hall to whisper about a howl in the night. Now, we gather in forums, group chats, and inboxes, whispering, and sometimes shouting about an unverified story, a fleeting emotion, or a name we barely know. Back then, fear spread because people lacked knowledge. Today, fear spreads because we have too much information. The monster no longer runs on 4 legs or bears sharp teeth. The monster now appears in the form of collective outrage, contagious anxiety, pressure to conform, loneliness amplified in a connected world. The dark places in our minds we hide behind polite smiles and glowing screens. And when someone today behaves differently, a small mistake, a moment of weakness, a careless comment, the reaction can resemble a medieval werewolf trial. Fast, emotional, unforgiving, unquestioned. We no longer tie people to stakes in the village square, but we can trap them in labels they cannot escape. We no longer burn pyres, but we can make someone feel as if the world turned against them overnight. We no longer believe in shape-shifting, but we believe in stories spread so quickly no one pauses to ask, is this even true? When we look at the mass hysteria of the Middle Ages, we think we've grown past it. But if we're honest, we still share the same fears. We still create monsters when we fail to understand one another. And sometimes, we become part of the crowd, throwing stones without realizing it. The only difference is, back then, the darkness lived in the forest. Today, the darkness lives online, in our thoughts, in those brief moments when we forget that every human, no matter how different, hurts the same way. But if the history of the werewolf teaches us anything, it is this: monsters are not born in the wild. Monsters are born from fear we don't understand. And fear disappears only when we choose empathy over judgment. If this chapter made you think of the invisible creatures of our own age, the ones we create, fear, and feed, feel free to share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe, because next comes the softest part of the journey, where darkness fades like breath in the cold, and the story returns to its source: moonlight, the forest, and silence. And then, after all the whispers, all the trials, all the misunderstood lives, all the legends woven from fear and sorrow, we return to where it all began: a long night, a forest, and the moon hanging above like a thin piece of silver, soft and distant. Imagine yourself standing once more at the edge of a medieval European forest, but this time, not to fear, this time, to understand. There is no howl tightening your chest, only the wind moving gently through the treetops, carrying the scent of damp wood, soil, and the traces of a time long gone. In that quiet light, you realize something those long ago villagers never had the chance to see. The werewolf was never a monster. It was a story humans told to make sense of their own fears. When a community was exhausted, they created the werewolf to place blame. When a lonely person lived differently, they were made into a werewolf so others could feel safe. When an age didn't understand illness, it called it transformation. When a generation no longer feared the forest, they reshaped the werewolf into art, beautiful, sorrowful, deeply human. The werewolf changed with every century. every culture, every voice. But one thing never changed. It has always been a mirror reflecting the darkness inside us. In the medieval night, darkness lived in the forest. In the modern night, darkness lives in the things we never say aloud. The quiet anxieties, the swallowed anger, the moments we feel different from everyone else, the fear of losing control. The werewolf endures not because it lives in the woods, but because it lives in the human mind. In the unlit spaces where instinct meets reason, where weakness meets strength, where we confront the wildness inside ourselves. And as this story gently closes, as the moon lowers and the forest softens into memory, we understand. What keeps a legend alive is not fear, it is empathy. Empathy for those who were misunderstood. Empathy for eras that had no tools to understand themselves. Empathy for the shadowed corners inside each of us. Perhaps that is why, after hundreds of years, the werewolf still walks into our dreams not to frighten us, but to remind us that we are not alone in the struggle between human and beast, between light and darkness. And finally, as you close this story, whether you sit in a dim room or lie back letting a gentle voice carry you towards sleep, leave a small stillness in your heart, a quiet moment to remember that every legend, no matter how frightening, is born from something profoundly human. And if this soft journey has left you feeling a little more at ease, a little more connected to the past and to yourself, feel free to leave a small comment or subscribe, not for the numbers, but because every shared word is a tiny spark in the night, keeping the story alive and keeping a gentle place open within the darkness.